I'm Bob Canary, and I'd like to talk a bit about the sonnet in the Elizabethan Age. It was a period rife with sonnets, and it also marked a transition from sonnets by courtier poets to those by professional poets. Above all, of course, it was the age of Shakespeare's sonnets. But there were also sonnets by important poets like Sidney and Spenser, and by rather too many other poets. Now, the sonnet had been imported into England by two of Henry VIII's courtiers, Sir Thomas Wyatt and the Earl of Surrey, and they set the form of the English sonnet through their translations, adaptations, and imitations of the sonnets of the great Italian poet Petrarch. The reigns of Henry's immediate successors, the sickly Edward VI and Bloody Mary, were too taken up with political and religious infighting to produce many memorable sonnets. But the reign of Elizabeth I was a golden age for sonnets. It may have helped that the sonnet was a form favored by the golden boy of Elizabethan England, Sir Philip Sidney. His Astrophel and Stella helped make fashionable the sonnet sequence, a set of sonnets individual enough to stand on their own, but linked as part of a common story. Like Wyatt and Surrey, Sidney was a courtier. He was a brother of one of Elizabeth's favorites, Robert Dudley, whom she made the Earl of Leicester, and he married a daughter of Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's chief minister at the time, famous for his development of a network of spies all over Europe. And Sidney himself was not an especially important political figure, though he was an active member of the Protestant faction at court. He was, however, known as the very model of a perfect courtier, a reputation he cemented by dying bravely at the age of 31. Now, the 108 sonnets of Astrophel and Stella are not, of course, addressed to Sidney's wife. If the lady addressed is a real person at all, it's probably Penelope Devereux, the wife of a Lord Rich. In writing a sequence of sonnets celebrating his love for an unattainable lady, Sidney was following the very best Italian models. Dante longs for Beatrice, Petrarch for Laura, and now Sidney will long for Stella. Now here's the first poem in the sequence, in which the poet claims that studying and imitating other poems did him no good. Loving in truth, and fain in verse my love to show, that she, dear she, might take some pleasure of my pain. Pleasure might cause her read, reading might make her know, knowledge might pity win, and pity grace obtain. I sought fit words to paint the blackest face of woe, studying inventions fine, her wits to entertain, oft turning others' leaves to see if thence might flow some fresh and fruitful showers upon my sunburned brain. But words came halting forth, wanting invention's stay. Invention, nature's child, fled stepdame's studies' blows, and others' feet still seemed but strangers in my way. Thus great with child to speak, and helpless in my throes, biting my truant pen, beating myself for spite. Fool, said my muse to me, look in thy heart and write. Now, the poet hopes that his lady will take pity on him if he shows how his love for her has plunged him into blackest face of woe. So he looks through the poems of others, hoping to find inspiration there. But study of them simply chases away his own creativity, leaving him with much to say and helpless to say it, until his muse tells him, look in thy heart and write. The first 8 lines, the octave, are a single unit, in fact, a single sentence, saying what he tries to do. And the last 6, the sestet, are the results. This slight division between the octave and the sestet is, as some of you may remember from last week, a characteristic of the traditional form inherited from the Italian sonnet. Sidney also follows the Italian sonnet form in restricting himself to 2 rhymes in the first 8 lines. Now, Sidney himself was about the last aristocratic courtier to be an important English poet. It's true that Lord Byron had a title, but Byron was far from a courtier, since he cordially hated most monarchs, including his own. I suppose we might stretch the definition of important to include this handsome devil. This is Charles II's drinking buddy, John Wilmot, better known as Lord Rochester. Now, here's a little ditty Rochester wrote about his friend and king. It's not a sonnet, but I certainly can't resist quoting it. We have a pretty, witty king, whose word no man relies on. He never said a foolish thing, and never did a wise one. Now, this little poem is 4 lines long. In the jargon of poetry, it's a quatrain. And instead of an octave and sestet, most sonnets in English consist of 3 quatrains capped off with a final couplet. Surrey devised this form, and it is roughly the form used by Sir Edmund Spenser, the most important poet of the Elizabethan Age other than Shakespeare. Now, Spenser was employed by courtiers, but not one himself. Spenser, of course, is best known for the Faerie Queene, which is one of those major works you are supposed to know about, but which only the most dedicated of readers reads all the way through. For that matter, Spenser himself left the poem incomplete. But Spenser also wrote a long series of sonnets recording his courtship and marriage. Spenser's amoretti have their own complexities, and they are nowhere near as well regarded as the Faerie Queene. I much prefer them myself, but that may just be my fondness for sonnets. In any case, here is Spenser's variation of a deer hunting metaphor used by Petrarch and in the first great English sonnet, Wyatt's, who lists to hunt. Like as a huntsman after weary chase, seeing the game from him escaped away, sits down to rest him in some shady place, with panting hounds beguiled of their prey. So after long pursuit and vain essay, when I all weary had the chase forsook, the gentle deer returned the self-same way, thinking to quench her thirst at the next brook. There she, beholding me with milder look, sought not to fly, but fearless still did bide, till I in hand her yet half trembling took, and with her own good will her firmly tied. Strange thing meseemed, to see a beast so wild, so goodly one, with her own will beguiled. Exhausted by his fruitless pursuit, the poet gives up the chase only to find that the doe has come to the same brook at which he is resting, and there she submits herself to him of her own free will. It's a nice little sonnet, and for me at least, it gains a little something for knowing that Petrarch and Wyatt before Surrey have used the same imagery, because we can then appreciate the way Spenser is changing the outcome. Because Spenser does not love in vain. In fact, he has this radical notion that love could end in marriage. That makes the Spenserian sonnet sequence a little different from most Elizabethan sequences. Now, there's something else different about the Spenserian sonnet sequence. You might have noticed that in each of the quatrains, the rhyme of the second and fourth line of one quatrain become the rhyme of the first and the third lines of the next quatrain. This is a very unusual form and a very difficult one, which means that very few poets subsequent to Spenser have attempted it, certainly not for a long sequence. It's conventional to diagram this form using letters to represent the different rhymes, so that the form of a Spenserian sonnet would look like this: A, B, B, C, B, C, C, D, C, D, and then the final couplet, E, E. Now, he hasn't had that many imitators because most of his contemporaries found it easier to use the simpler form pioneered by Surrey, which has a new pair of rhymes for each of the quatrains. And most of them also followed Sidney and Surrey, and for that matter, Wyatt, by dedicating their sonnets to an unattainable lady. And Elizabethan England was awash with sonnet sequences like that. Such Elizabethan sonnet sequences include Lycia by Giles Fletcher the Elder, Calica by Fulk Greville, Phyllis by Thomas Lodge, Diana by Henry Constable, Ideas Mere by Michael Drayton, and Delia by Samuel Daniel. Some of these are pretty tedious, and I don't want to take the time and don't have the inclination to read you samples of all of them, although it might well justify my calling this talk The Sonnet Loves in Vain. But I do want to call attention to the sonnets of the best of these, Samuel Daniel. Now, Daniel was a gentleman of sort. He went to Oxford after all. But in his early years, he worked for his living, including as a tutor to the son of Mary Sidney, the Countess of Pembroke. His reputation as a poet and dramatist eventually secured him a sinecure position in the court of Anne of Denmark, the wife of Elizabeth's successor, James I. He was a friend of Shakespeare and Marlowe, and his reputation survived his death for some time. Now, the sonnets to Delia, however, seem to date from his time under the patronage of the Countess of Pembroke. And the Countess was the sister of Sir Philip Sidney, and she was herself a well-thought-of poet. Her salon included other poets, including Spenser, Ben Jonson, and Michael Drayton. And she encouraged Daniel's efforts. She may well be the Delia addressed in his poems. In my favorite Daniel poem, in fact, most people's favorite Daniel poem, Daniel asks sleep not to trouble him with dreams. Care, charmer, sleep, son of sable night, brother to death, in silent darkness born, relieve my languish and restore the light with dark forgetting of my care's return. And let the day be time enough to mourn the shipwreck of my ill-adventured youth. Let waking eyes suffice to wail their scorn without the torment of the night's untruth. Seize dreams, the imagery of our day desires to model forth the passions of the morrow. Never let the rising sun approve you liars to add more grief to aggravate my sorrow. Still let me sleep, embracing clouds in vain, and never wake to feel the day's disdain. Daniel wants sleep to give him a time to forget the disappointments of the day, perhaps romantic, that's the day's disdain, and rather than trouble him with dreams of his day desires, which can only be proven false when he wakes. If he could, he would sleep like that and never wake. Now, this starts out as a Spenserian sonnet with interlocking rhymes in the first two quatrains, but Daniel can't keep it up and uses all new rhymes in the third quatrain. Most English sonnet writers, including most Elizabethans, just settle for separate rhymes in each quatrain, the form pioneered by Surrey. We would diagram it like this: A, B, C, D, E, F, and again a final couplet, G, G. Now this form still imposes constraints upon the poet. That's really the whole point of formal verse. But it's just easier to make 2 lines rhyme than it is to make 4 lines rhyme, so a poet can concentrate on the sense of the poem. And this pattern can also suggest a pattern for the sense. Now, the old octave sestet division suggests a question-response pattern or a point-counterpoint. The three-quatrain with closing couplet pattern suggests having variations on the same theme in the quatrain and followed by a kicker in the couplet. To see how this works, let's pretend for a bit that we are Shakespeare. Admittedly a bit of a stretch, but it's about time we talked about Shakespeare if we're going to talk about Elizabethan sonnets. Anyway, we want to write a sonnet to impress our mistress. We want to praise her beauty, but we also don't want to sound like every other sonnet out there. So perhaps we can turn things around and make the point that we don't say that kind of thing. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. And taking another feature, coral is far more red than her lips red. Now it's about time we started finding some rhymes, so let's try, if snow be white, why then her breasts are done. Now we've gone from her eyes to her lips to her breasts, but prudence suggests that we stop there in reverse direction. So here's one. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. We can vary the next stanza by having the comparisons take up 2 lines apiece. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. That doesn't mean, by the way, that the lady has bad breath, and there's been some changes in the connotations of reeks through the years. Now, we could go on like this forever, of course, but since it's a Shakespearean sonnet, our next step will be another 4-line stanza. And we will make this one about more like her actions than her appearance. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And now it's time for our final little 2-line kicker. We have one ready here. And yet, by heaven, I think my love is rare, as any she belied with false compare. That is, in fact, Shakespeare's sonnet number 130. But this poet has a good deal more choices to make than just the general sense of a sonnet and the specific rhyme scheme. For one thing, if it's to be a sonnet, the rhythm of the lines has to be mainly iambic pentameter. And that means that we have lines with 5 units of a weak stress followed by a relatively strong stress. Now, this probably wasn't a problem for Shakespeare. Iambic pentameter is the rhythm used in both his sonnets and in the blank verse of his plays. And when you write in one rhythm regularly, words seem to naturally fall in that fashion. Even so, there are choices being made, even if they are made unconsciously. So, for example, we could have said, and yet I think my love as rare. But since that has only 4 units with a weak stress followed by a strong stress, it's just not the same. It's an iambic tetrameter. To make it iambic pentameter, we need another strong stress in there, and so we swear by heaven. Now, the fact is that most sonnets most iambic pentameter poems of any sort have a certain number of optional phrases to fill out lines here and there. In fact, you can take the last 6 lines of this sonnet and replace 2 syllables in each of them, even keeping the same rhyme scheme. I love to hear her voice, yet well I know that music hath more pleasing sound. I never saw a goddess go, my mistress treads upon the ground. And yet I think my love as rare as any praised with false compare. We haven't lost much. One cannot always retain the rhymes when cutting Shakespeare's sonnets down to iambic tetrameter, but so far as I know, one can always cut them down while retaining most of the sense. In this case, we haven't lost too much of the sense of the poem, certainly eliminating I grant from I grant I never saw a goddess go, or by heaven from and yet by heaven I think my love is rare, is mainly cutting out padding. So we're left with a skinnier poem, but one which is recognizably still the same poem. Now, does that mean there's something wrong with the original version, the one Shakespeare wrote in iambic pentameter? I don't think so, but let's put it all together and you can decide for yourselves. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. Now, the point, remember, is to remind us that a poem is a set of choices. A sonnet is a form which constrains those choices. By the way, even when he felt like it, Shakespeare was perfectly capable of breaking those constraints, even basic ones like that decreeing that sonnets should be written iambic pentameter. His sonnet number 145, if you want to go look at it, is actually written in iambic tetrameter, those shorter lines we were playing with. And although the rule is that sonnets have 14 lines, Sonnet 99 has 15 lines rather than 14. But who was this mistress whose eyes are nothing like the sun? We don't know. We don't know, in fact, is the answer to many, many questions about the sonnets and about Shakespeare himself. Now, my own feeling is it doesn't matter any more than reading celebrity gossip about actors in a movie affects the meaning and quality of the movie they're in. But that hasn't kept people from filling in the gaps with wild speculation, a game in which many serious scholars have joined. For example, we know that the sonnets were first published by Thomas Thorpe in 1609. But we don't know when they were written or how they came into the hands of Thorpe. And that's because lyric poems in this period were generally circulated in manuscript, sometimes for years before they were published. Thorpe obviously got a hold of a manuscript copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, but we don't know how. And speculation ranges from Shakespeare supplying the manuscript himself to Thorne's stealing the copy. We just don't know. Now, it's been honored that Thorpe was too established a publisher to have obtained the manuscript underhandedly. This is an argument satisfactory only to those who have been lucky in their dealings with publishers. On the other hand, the notion that Shakespeare would have objected to the poem's publication only satisfies those who have had few dealings with poets. Sonnet 18, in fact, obviously assumes that the sonnets will somehow survive to posterity. And it also has another way of avoiding false comparisons, as spoken of in Sonnet 130. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. You might notice that this is a Shakespeare sonnet with a change in direction after the 8th line, rather than before the couplet. Now, this poem, of course, is also another example of a poet promising that their poetry will bring their loved ones immortality. And it does not prove that Shakespeare willingly supplied the manuscript to Thorpe, much less took any active part in their publication. And that uncertainty means that we cannot be sure whether the arrangement of the poems is Shakespeare's or Thorpe's. Nor does it tell us whose immortality Shakespeare is guaranteeing, or even that person's gender. Read in isolation, one would assume that the poet is addressing someone of the opposite sex. But that person addressed was a woman. But this is Sonnet 18 in the sequence, and has been placed immediately after 17 poems addressed to a young man, urging him to hurry up and have kids. Here, for example, is Sonnet number 3. Look in thy glass, and tell the face thou viewest, now is the time that face should form another, whose fresh repair if now thou not renewest, thou dost beguile the world, unbless some mother. For where is she so fair, whose uneared womb disdains the tillage of thy husbandry? Or who is he so fond will be the tomb of his self-love, to stop posterity? Thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime. So thou through windows of thine age shall see, despite of wrinkles, this thy golden time. But if thou live remembered not to be, die singled, and thine image dies with thee. The young man should tell himself it's time he has a child. And if he doesn't hurry up and do so, he's being unfair to both the world and some woman who might otherwise be the child's mother. After all, what woman wouldn't be glad to have him? Is he so fond of himself that he cares nothing for posterity? Just as the young man's mother can recall her youthful beauty by looking at the young man, so should he beget a child whose beauty will remind him of this, thy golden age, rather than die unremembered. Now, despite the ambiguity of sonnets like the Sonnet 18 before this, many Shakespeare scholars believe that all of the first 126 sonnets in the sequence are addressed to this young man, generally called the fair young man. Now here is one candidate for the young man, Henry Wriothesley, the Earl of Southampton, a patron of Shakespeare. Shakespeare dedicated the narrative poems Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece to Southampton. He is considered a possibility because his initials are H.W., and the first publication of Shakespeare's poems was dedicated to a Mr. W.H. The dedication page is at least one of the few pieces of evidence outside of the sonnets themselves. To the only begetter of these ensuing sonnets, Mr. W.H., all happiness and that eternity promised by the ever-living poet wishes the well-wishing adventurer in setting forth. Now, of course, H.W. is not W.H., and calling an earl Mr. would have been bad form, so there are other candidates for the fair young man. some with initials like WH and some not. We have, of course, no way of knowing whether the fair young man and Mr. W.H. are the same person. It could have been a friend or patron of the publisher Thorpe, since the initial TT with which the dedication is signed stands for Thomas Thorpe rather than Shakespeare. It could have been some acquaintance of Shakespeare whose name we don't know now. My favorite theory, which has some distinguished defenders, is that WH is a typo for WH, since William Shakespeare is obviously, from one point of view, the only begetter of these sonnets, though that would mean he is wishing himself immortality. Or was Shakespeare the author of these sonnets? Those who refuse to believe that Shakespeare wrote the dramas attributed to him generally include the sonnets, arguing, for example, that the fair young man was certainly of noble birth and could not therefore have been Shakespeare's lover, a rather shaky argument. In addition, Sonnet 135 spends a great deal of time in wordplay with will as intent and will as a nickname for William Shakespeare. And the wordplay is considerably more amusing if one happens to know that the word will was also an Elizabethan slang for both the male and the female genitals. Whoever hath a wish, thou hast thy will, and will to boot, and will an overplus. More than enough am I that vex thee still, to thy sweet will, making addition thus. And surely the poet thinks she has room for one more lover, to let his will enter hers. Wilt thou, whose will is large and spacious, not once vouchsafe to hide my will and thine? Shall will in others seem right gracious, and in my will no fair acceptance shine? You have so many lovers, why not me? The sea, all water, yet receives rain still, and in abundance addeth to his store. So thou, being rich in will, add to thy will one will of mine, to make thy large will more. Let no unkind, no fair beseechers kill. Think all but one, and me in that one will. One more lover shouldn't be a problem. To hide thy will in mine, indeed. This kind of thing is one more example of how Shakespeare's sonnet sequence differs from others of the time, if it is in fact intended as a sequence rather than as a mere collection. We're certainly far from the unattainable Beatrices and Laura of Dante and Petrarch. But the pun on his name does seem to make this sonnet, at least, obviously by William Shakespeare. Of all the uncertainty surrounding the sonnets, uncertainty about who wrote them is the least of our problems. Now, there are some other characters generally found within the sonnets. For example, within the first 126 sonnets, those thought to be addressed to the fair young man, are 9 or 10 sonnets which speak of another poet who may have supplanted Shakespeare in the young man's affections. This is someone known, therefore, as the rival poet. Our friend Samuel Daniel is one of many possible rivals that have been mentioned. Now, in some of these sonnets, Shakespeare professes to think the rival poet far superior to himself as a poet, so much so that it seems almost presumptuous for Shakespeare to write at all about the person addressed. Here, for example, is Sonnet 80. Oh, how I faint when I of you do write, knowing a better spirit doth use your name, and in the praise thereof spends all his might to make me tongue-tied speaking of your fame. But since your worth wide as the ocean is, the humble as the proudest sail doth bear, my saucy bark, inferior far to his, on your broad main doth wilfully appear. Your shallowest help will hold me up afloat, whilst he upon your soundless deep doth ride, or being wrecked, I am a worthless boat, he of tall building and of goodly pride. Then if he thrive, and I be cast away, the worst was this, my love was my decay. Now, it's pretty hard to believe that Shakespeare thought of himself as a worthless boat, especially when compared to any of the various contemporaries who've been suggested as models for the rival poet, if in fact there was a rival poet. And you might recall that an earlier sonnet promised the young man that Shakespeare's verses would make him, or I suppose her, immortal. Now, if the first 126 sonnets are often thought to be addressed to the fair young man, most of the remaining 28 are thought to be about a woman, often referred to as the dark lady, or the dark lady of the sonnets. By this time, it'll not surprise you to hear me stress that we cannot be certain that such a person existed or who she might be. And it's equally unsurprising that a great deal of time and effort has been spent in advocating one candidate or another. Now, the dark lady is called dark because of lines like, "If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun," which can be taken to mean that her skin is not fashionably pale, with some critics believing that she might be of African descent. Now, it also could mean, of course, that Shakespeare has noticed that human breasts are not white. In that case, she is dark because she has dark hair, as in, "If hairs be white, black wires grow on her head." Another question, of course, is who cares? The lady is married, so in that respect these last sonnets somewhat resemble the sonnet sequences of other Elizabethan poets. This lady, however, is not exactly unattainable. Shakespeare is not necessarily loving in vain, and he would not be her only lover, if one can judge from the sonnet with the multiple plays upon the will. Given the double meanings of will in Elizabethan times, to say that the lady has will and overplus suggests that she gets around. And given the sexual mores of Elizabethan London, this does not go very far in identifying her. Mary Fitton, for example, had children out of wedlock by 3 different men, although she did marry the third of them. She was one of the popular candidates for the title of Dark Lady because one of her affairs was with William Herbert, who became the 3rd Earl of Pembroke, and whose initials W.H. have made him another candidate for the fair young man. As a reminder of what a small world this was, Pembroke had been tutored by Samuel Daniel again, his mother being Mary Sidney, the Countess of Pembroke. Now, Mary Fitton was for a while a lady-in-waiting to the Queen. And another popular candidate, Lucy Morgan, was as well. That is to say, she was a maid in the Queen before going into business as a brothel keeper. Now, the lady referred to in the sonnets may have been sexually rather active. The poet hardly claims that his own interest in her is not primarily sexual. In Sonnet 129, his awareness that this is so leads to a moment of self-disgust in which lust in action, that is to say sex, is degrading and lust in anticipation almost worse. The expense of spirit and a waste of shame is lust in action. Until action, lust is perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame, savage, extreme, rude, cruel, not to trust. Enjoyed no sooner, but despised straight. Past reason hunted, and no sooner had past reason hated as a swallowed bait, on purpose laid to make the taker mad. Mad in pursuit, and in possession so, having and in quest to have extreme, a bliss in proof, and proved a very woe. Before, a joy proposed, behind, a dream. All this the world well knows. Yet none knows well to shun the hem that leads men to this hell. That is, we know better, but it doesn't seem to stop us. Sonnet 129 is a bit unusual, however, even for Shakespeare. Shakespeare's more usual tone is a certain rueful resignation. In Sonnet 138, for example, an older lover pretends to believe his younger mistress is faithful, although he knows better, while she pretends not to notice how very old he is. When my love swears that she is made of truth, I do believe her, though I know she lies, that she might think me some untutored youth, unlearned in the world's false subtleties. Thus vainly thinking that she thinks me young, although she knows my days are past the best, simply I credit her false-speaking tongue. On both sides thus is simple truth suppressed. But wherefore says she not she is unjust? And wherefore say not I that I am old? Oh, love's best habit is in seeming trust, and age in love loves not to have years told. Therefore I lie with her, and she with me, and in our faults by lies we flattered be. She does not admit she lies to him, and he pretends to believe her. He does not remind her that he is old, and she pretends she doesn't notice that he is. And with these lies, they can lie with one another. It's in its own way, I suppose. The cynicism of this little arrangement is as startling as that of the previous sonnet. If we go to Shakespeare's sonnets, therefore, expecting a sequence of love poems to an idealized lady, like those of Petrarch or Shakespeare's contemporaries, we are in for a surprise. Shakespeare's sonnets are not merely better than others in the Elizabethan age. They're often very different in theme and tone. Now, if you want to explore Shakespeare's sonnets further, or those of other Elizabethans, there are many fine editions available and a raft of websites. Many websites, at least for Shakespeare, include both the poems and helpful analyses. Of the analyses of Shakespeare's sonnets, Wikipedia is really as good as any. Before reading analyses, of course, I'd suggest sitting down and reading your way through the sonnets on your own. It doesn't take long, and it avoids having your experience of the poems unduly colored by whatever commentary you happen to read. Feel free to ignore mine as well. I'm Bob Canary. I'm a retired professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Parkside, and my email is canary@uwp.edu.